European pillory, but much more terrible. Even though similar contraptions were used by some European countries, East Asia is more known for it. Even though people with these boards were able to move, sometimes their movements were restricted with chains. Also, it was not uncommon for people wearing kangs to starve to death, as they were unable to feed themselves because they simply couldn't reach food thanks to this large board around their head. Also, heavier boards could have been used for more severe crimes. I believe one weighed more than 70 kilograms or 150 pounds. Sometimes, multiple people would share the same board. Suffocation in ash was a capital punishment in ancient Persia. They would fill a room with ash and the criminal was thrown into the chamber. But ash would eventually settle and leave condemned with cleaner air. Nope, Persians had it figured out. They put giant wheels there which stirred the ash up so that it created a storm of powdered embers to choke the victim. I gave it a lower score because that ended suffering a bit quicker. Quicker is the wrong term when it comes to oubliettes. The French term oubliette, which I just butchered, means to forget. It was given this name because victims were essentially forgotten, left to die in a dark dungeon. If prisoners were lucky, a little light could enter through a trapdoor which was the only way in or out. No bed, no toilet, rats, bugs, coldness and possible remains of previous prisoner. Some oubliettes were often designed as a narrow pits barely wide enough for a person to lie down. Sometimes, these oubliettes were in castle walls, so victims were surrounded by the noise and signs of life around them as they slowly withered away. Similar to being in school in great weather and hearing children playing outside. Some prisoners were given food, so their suffering was prolonged, possibly for decades. It's hard to say if oubliettes or immurement was worse. In one hand, immurement meant certain eventual death. On the other hand, living in oubliette may have lasted for decades, plus the slight hope that prisoner had would be part of torture. Immurement means placing a live person within a small enclosed space without any exits. This would mean a certain death, most likely in a couple of days due to dehydration. To be honest, it was probably worse than oubliette, because some prisoners may have been fed through a small hole and many immurement places were certainly smaller than oubliette rooms. Schwendentrank was a Swedish method of torture and sometimes execution where the victim was forced to swallow large amounts of foul liquids such as excrements. This method was used by Swedish troops during 30 Years' War on enemy peasants or civilians to force them to hand over their valuables. I sincerely believe that this torture method was usually not long and was stopped when troops got what they asked for. This punishment sadly involved innocent animals. In ancient Rome, those who killed their fathers were punished with being shoved into a leather bag. But they were not alone in the bag. Various animals would be put also, creating a complete chaos in the sack. During ruling days of Emperor Hadrian, they would put a monkey, a rooster, a dog and a viper. After the sack was closed, all animals including criminal were thrown into the river. In ancient Sparta, there was a nasty ruler by the name of Nabis. He had an equally terrible wife, Apega. I don't know if he did this out of love or hate for his wife, but he created an automaton that would resemble his wife. An automaton in ancient world? Yes, automatons, believe it or not, were not that rare. For example, the simplest automaton could be a mechanical watch, and more complex ones could be humanoid-looking things that could write something on a paper. Like this little creepy sucker. Anyway, the Nabis dude created a robot wife with open wide arms. Spartan people who were avoiding paying taxes were sent by Nabis to his wife. This fake wife was covered with iron nails and the arms were capable of crushing the body of its victim. I'm not sure if the Spartans were forced or tricked into hugging this device. This method of torture was used by Inquisition and it was quite simple. An iron fork with two sharp fork-like ends was attached to the victim's neck with a strap. One end stabbing jaw and other pushing into lower neck or top of breastbone. The victim couldn't lay down on back or speak because the sharp end was stabbing lower jaw. The pain was one thing, but the worst part is that heretics with such punishment were strapped with this fork for a long time. Anatsurushi isn't particularly a medieval torture practice. It was done in 17th century Japan to coerce Christians to recant their faith. These victims would have been hung head down by their feet and often placed in a hole filled with poop. Since they were in a bat-like position and people are not meant to be in such a way, their forehead was cut to decrease blood pressure. Many sufferers did recant their faith because it was horrible. For some tough people, like for example Lorenzo Ruiz, he never broke under this torture. Okay, listen, from now on it is getting pretty dark, so be warned. I actually winced when I imagined someone being on this thing. There were variations, for example, it could have been a triangular device or pyramid shaped, also known as Judas cradle, or just a simple log with a sharp edge. I mean, sitting on such things would be horrible, but it wasn't enough. They also had to attach weights to the victim's feet. Sometimes, they would attach gears similar to the rack, so the victims would be pulled down with higher force. And I thought school chairs were uncomfortable. Without a doubt, the most infamous way of torture since it became part of symbol for suffering of Jesus Christ. Crucifixion was a popular method to punish those who were sentenced to death in ancient Rome or Persia. It was so bad that Roman citizens were exempted from such punishment unless the crime was severe, like for example high treason. So why crucifixion is bad? Well, first the condemned was stripped naked, then a huge iron nail was driven through the feet and arms. The whole thing was displayed in public, so the condemned would also feel humiliation. Interestingly, due to hyperextended arms, it was difficult to breathe and victims would die slowly due to asphyxiation. In order to take fresh breath of air, they would have to pull themselves up using nailed legs and arms. But in 2023, scientists discredited suffocation as the primary cause of death from crucifixion. The primary reason was probably dehydration. The legendary rack, the one which makes people with bad back wondering if it would relieve the pain. It would, by redirecting attention to even more dire pain. Even though in movies this torture device usually looks like a table, in real world it could have many variations. The victim's ankles were fastened to one roller and the wrists were chained to another. I also have to mention that hands were usually strapped behind the back, so you can imagine the horror. As the torture progressed, a ratchet system would slowly stretch victims apart. First, the joints would be dislocated, then it would be pulled apart, creating unimaginable pain. As torturers still kept pulling, even muscle fibers were stretched, which made them lose the ability to contract. As a cherry on top, some racks even had spikes in the middle. This device was featured in many articles and videos as one of the worst torture devices, but it might have just been a myth, as some historians find it hard to believe since there is not much of evidence. It worked like this. In ancient Greece, they would put criminals inside a hollow bronze bull, shut the door and start fire underneath this statue. There were tubes inside the bull which somehow converted screams of a roasting criminal into a similar sound of bulls bellowing. It was said that after the execution, victims' scorched bones shone like jewels and were converted into a jewelry. Balenciaga of ancient world. Good news are that the guy who invented such bull was later thrown himself into it and burned alive. That guy was Phalaris. You should read about him. Really mean guy. This method wasn't widely used, but it is no myth since this dude, Dietrich Sonoy, used rat torture on prisoners. It worked simple. The prisoner was laid and strapped to the table with a naked belly. Then a bowl or a cage with rats was placed open side down on the naked body of prisoner. Then the hot charcoal was piled on the bowl. The rats would bite into the very balls of the victim in an attempt to escape the heat. It is higher on the scale than the brazen bull because suffering was longer. You probably have heard of Vlad Tepes or Vlad the Impaler, which was a cruel ruler of Romania. Guess what? The guy liked to impale people. Apparently, it was his most favorite ways of punishment. Usually, torturers were very concerned for their victims. They didn't want them dying too quickly. One way of prolonging the suffering was letting the stake follow the spine, so that the impalement would not damage vital organs. People with such punishment could survive for a couple of days, feeling stake sinking deeper each hour. Man, the cruelty of humans has no bounds. Flaying is simple. It is the process of removing one's skin when they are alive. The scariest part is that victims could survive for a couple of days without skin. If less skin was removed, this torture could have been prolonged for weeks. Nerves and raw meat would be exposed to outside elements, get dry and get extremely painful. According to dermatologists, typical causes of death due to flaying are shock, critical loss of blood, or other body fluids, hypothermia or infections. Unlike some wounds which can heal, huge loss of skin means that it can't grow back, so the condemned was absolutely doomed.